At least my screw-ups don't cost $500 million. Right now, the US Navy is facing a problem: how to reopen the Strait of Hormuz against Iranian attacks while protecting civilian cargo tankers. But good news, the US Navy spent billions designing a ship to fight this kind of fight in this kind of geography against this kind of enemy. Bad news, it is quite possibly one of the worst ships we have ever built, and also, for some reason, we literally just moved them from the Middle East, the place where all the fighting is right now, to a random port in Malaysia. Today we are going to be talking about the Independence-class Littoral Combat Ship, or LCS, a futuristic-looking hunk of floating metal that will likely go down as the Navy's biggest screw-up in living memory. So budget overrun the like and subscribe button and let's talk about it. This is the USS Independence, an LCS-2 class ship that the Navy got delivered from the shipyard back in 2009. It was quietly decommissioned in July of 2021, just 12 years after it set sail. You want to know why it was decommissioned quietly after just 12 years? It sucks. It's super vulnerable to getting hit by anything explosive while also being a giant target itself, and is super underarmed for its size. It barely has enough crew to actually keep it going, which is not ideal because it is a maintenance nightmare, and the fancy design features that give it the sci-fi look actively made it a lot worse. The only noteworthy thing an LCS ship has ever done, was record a UFO back in 2019. Alright, I got a little too heated there at the end, but before I talk more about why this sucks so much, a brief detour. Now, I talk about a lot of crazy military stuff on this channel, and a lot of said military stuff is dangerous. That's kind of the whole point of militaries existing. But the real world can be just as dangerous, and that danger can lead to some not-so-stellar outcomes if your goal is to be an uninjured human person. But if you fail to keep your health at 100% for one reason or another, that brings us to today's sponsor, Morgan & Morgan. There's a reason why protective gear exists in combat, just like there's a reason why Morgan & Morgan is America's largest injury law firm. With 1,000 attorneys in all 50 states, they've won over $30 billion for their clients. With a track record going back over 35 years, they know a thing or two about fighting for the compensation you deserve. If you have the unfortunate chance to be injured by someone else's negligence, just know that you deserve to be paid. You only pay if they win your case. So if you end up working with them, they'll do everything they can to fight on your behalf. If you or someone else you know is dealing with an injury that was someone else's fault, you can check out Morgan & Morgan today by going to forthepeople.com/Taylor. Thank you to Morgan & Morgan for sponsoring the channel, and now back to the video. If you look at the US Navy's official website on this thing, it brags that the USS Independence served for more than a decade. If that sounds like a long time to you, dear viewer, keep in mind that modern aircraft carriers don't even refuel until they've sailed for 25 years straight. The United States currently has 17 of the original 19 Independence-class LCSs in service. And since the ship type first started operations in 2010, it has basically done absolutely nothing at all. A big portion of that is because of what kind of big boat this thing is. Oh, Justin, stop calling naval ships boats. No, I will not stop calling them boats. Go find something else to be mad about. Littoral combat ships are designed, as the name implies, for littoral zone operations. Littoral zone is fancy talk for the part of the water close to the shore. It's usually a good idea to have ships specifically designed for these kinds of regions because maneuvering in them can be a bit of a pain, and bigger ships like cruisers and destroyers are more effective at blowing up targets if they're farther away. Each Independence class is 418 feet long and 104 feet wide. This makes them about 100 feet shorter, but almost 40 feet wider than an Arleigh Burke destroyer, which is the US Navy's kinda do-everything ship at the moment. The reason the Independences are so wide and why they look the way they do is because they are trimaran designs, and that means it has a primary hull, which is this part right here, and two smaller outrigger hulls, which are these parts. You see a lot of these kinds of designs in those high-speed sailing competitions. Also, I just want to float the idea that if anyone watching has anything to do with the Special Olympics, if you would like to expand the events that are run, high-speed sailing gets my vote. But what this design does is allow the ship to sail in very shallow waters and provide a lot of horizontal stability, which is good for things like launching helicopters, shooting stuff, and not making the new guys seasick. So far so good, right? Nothing too crazy. See, back in the early 2000s, the DoD put out a requirement for a small, agile, multi-purpose warship meant to operate specifically in littoral zones. Somewhere between 2.5 and 3 billion human person peoples currently reside on the planet Earth are in coastal zones. Generally speaking, war requires that humans are involved to some degree, so it's not insane to assume that a future war is going to involve the littoral zones. LCSs were meant to be an evolution of two older ship designs, the Oliver Hazard Perry frigate, cool name there by the way, and the Cyclone-class patrol ship. Two designs were down-selected a few years later, the Freedom class and the Independence class. I imagine that a third design would have been named something like the USA #1 Bald Eagle emoji class. Now, normally what you're supposed to do when you look at military prototypes as the military is actually pick one. The Navy did not do this. They decided they wanted to, quote, prototype at scale, see which one worked better over time in real-world deployments, and eventually just pick one. But they didn't do that. So as a result, in 2026, we still operate both ships of the LCS class. Originally, the Navy claimed that the LCS ship would be, quote, agile, stealthy, capable of defeating anti-axis and asymmetric threats, and fight in the littorals. Where on earth is there an asymmetric threat using anti-axis strategies in littoral zones? I'm coming up blank. Surely it will come to me. Also, if you're watching this in the future and we still haven't solved this problem, mentally insert a map of wherever this is happening in this square right here. See, it turns out that the Independence could not do any of those things initially listed out. The idea was that this would be a base ship that you could kind of just reconfigure to perform all kinds of mission sets. This was, of course, because back in the 2000s and 2010s, everyone was just foaming at the mouth trying to make everything modular. And there is a reason you don't hear the word modular pop up as much anymore. See, each ship was supposed to be fitted with different mission modules that they would swap out in port based on the mission they were tasked with. One was going to be for fighting submarines, one for fighting other surface vessels, and another for deploying troops to the shore. Back when the Navy came up with this brilliant concept, the thought was that you could pull into a port, load up a module, and be on your way in just a few hours. Turns out that some modules took weeks to install, and the record time they managed to get between the two easiest modules to swap between was 4 days. So the Navy obviously very quickly gave up on that concept. But they were still left with a design that had compromises in the name of modularity that would never actually be modular. Missions set in littoral zones is a very niche and specific kind of mission set, so designing your ship as a general use platform is going to cause some headaches. First and foremost, this thing has the word combat in its name. Combat implies you shoot at stuff, and you should assume that stuff is also going to shoot at you as well. LCS ships specifically are at a much higher risk of being hit than its blue water brethren, simply due to the fact that they are going to be really close to the coastline. Normally, if you want to track a combat ship, you got to send out drones, flying recon assets, and leverage spy satellite coverage to hunt it down. The targeting process for finding an Independence-class ship you want to blow up is basically just pointing at it with your finger. It's going to be in the target envelope of anything bigger than a machine gun, and that is a problem, because this thing has shit for armor. Most ships are made out of steel. The Independence class is made out of aluminum. And basically every test or exercise that these things ran, they were getting sunk left and right. Aluminum lacks the strength and density of steel. No shit. So the hull blows open and framework collapses under way less stress than other things. Aluminum also does not stand up well to fire. Things fired at warships do have a tendency to cause fires, so you can see the issue there. But while this thing does not have the best defense on Earth, that is actually made up by the fact that it also has a bad offense. Weapons and aiming sensors were envisioned to be primarily based on the modular mission attachments. So with those out of the picture, they almost exclusively run the few organic systems they come with. On the deck, you'll find a Mark 110 57mm gun, meant to take on small boats for the most part. It's pretty decent in that regard, but you couldn't use it for things like supporting ground troops. It is a direct fire weapon and fires rounds that are only a tiny bit bigger than the ones fired from IFVs. Independence classes also have CRAMs, which are medium-range point defense missiles. The problem is that this is all it has in terms of air defense. A swarm of anything, or even just 2 incoming drones from opposite directions, then you're going to be in a lot of trouble. The thing with these is that they're also for self-defense, not general air defense. Unlike a destroyer class of ship, the Independence class can't protect the sky for things other than itself, meaning that even if everything else worked, and we did have an armada of these in the Hormuz, it would still be pretty useless at taking down air threats against other ships like oil tankers. And when you know it, flying things constitute most of those threats. Darn it. Now, its electronic warfare defense suite that could do some things like jam incoming drones or missiles is reportedly to be actually fairly decent. But with advancements in automated terminal tracking with drones, that capability is going to be starting to get called into question. It does have 4 50 cal machine guns mounted on the sides for the crew to fire out, but those are the Navy equivalent of soldiers carrying backup pistols. Useless 99.9% of the time, but would be helpful if you got a kamikaze boat careening at you. Back in December of 2014, the Navy tried to up the LCS's punch a little bit with the Small Surface Combatant program that would have provided a bunch of upgrades to weapons and make up for the failures of the modular weapons platform designs. These would have essentially just transformed the LCSs into small destroyers. Now, you probably noticed that I just used the phrase would have just then, because it wasn't actually implemented, and the main upgrade that did get built in was the addition of a pair of naval strike missiles. Yes, that's actually what they're called. These are newer-ish over-the-horizon missiles meant to hit ships and some land targets. NSMs are, however, stupid expensive, coming in at $2.2 million each, and only have a 260-pound warhead that can hit targets 160 nautical miles away, which is not a lot of bang and range for your buck, and do not make for good land attack munitions compared to other things like the Tomahawk, which these can't fire. I'm starting to get angry again. I need to calm down, so join me while I get our collective blood pressures back to normal. Alright, that didn't work at all. One of the primary jobs this was intended to perform was minesweeping. Not bad. However, it does not actually sweep mines. Instead, it deploys remote drones and buoys that look for them themselves. Traditionally, minesweepers do things just like dragging a big cable underwater that would set mines off at a safe distance. And while this might sound kinda primitive, it's really hard to fuck up a metal cable you just chuck overboard. Using drones and stuff to do this sounds really modern, but the ones on the Independence class have reportedly not worked. And when you don't have an analog backup, you're pretty freaking useless. Doing it this way is also slower and more expensive. Using aluminum over steel does make the ship lighter, which allows it to go 44 knots if it's really booking it. And that is pretty fast for modern combat ships, and it's about 14 or 15 knots faster than a modern aircraft carrier. But here's the thing, super fast combat ships are very overrated. Now, I'm not saying that having slow boats is good. I know at least one of you just thought that's what I said, so put that thought back into your subconscious. But going 10 knots faster than other big ships is not going to be the deciding factor of getting hit by a missile or explosive. But not having aluminum armor would be the difference between surviving and not surviving the hit. It's important to keep in mind that when you are the captain of a very large, very expensive, and very vulnerable LCS, you're going to be taking a lot less risks when it comes to how, when, and where you do something. And having to be overly concerned how juicy a target you are makes you and your ship a whole lot less useful. Luckily though, if you are the captain, you don't have to be in charge of a lot of people, which probably makes your life a little easier. Each Independence class only has a max 75 people on it, and only 40 of those are the actual boat crew. Using more of your ship for war stuff instead of sacrificing space for human beings to eat and sleep in is theoretically a good thing, except when it isn't. According to the Navy, the LCS was designed to run with a minimal crew to save money. The government reports and Navy studies found sailors were overworked, sleep-deprived, and often couldn't operate the ship without extra personnel and contractors. Contractors are very expensive, by the way, and they usually also have attitude problems. The ship was designed with automation in mind, so jobs that typically would have been handled by people wouldn't have to be anymore, except those automated systems didn't work, and the few people that were there were pulling double duty. The Navy had to figure out a way to cram 20 more beds into the ship for additional sailors so that the existing crew could actually just get some sleep. And a big thing that God's sleepiest sailors were having to deal with were the mountains of mechanical problems this thing has. Independence classes use water jet propulsion instead of big propellers. That's good for going fast and floating in shallow waters, but they're very labor intensive due to them just sucking up everything in the water around them. They need a lot of TLC to keep going. TLC requires people, and these don't have a lot of people on them. Other things like an overly complex diesel-gas turbine combo means a lot of moving engine parts that break a lot. Again, good idea in theory, use diesel for efficient cruising speeds and gas turbines for those big jumps of velocity. Pretty much unnecessary and very maintenance heavy. What the Navy found was that all of these personnel and mechanical issue combos meant that things could not be out for very long, and that is the big thing here. They constantly have to pull into port for servicing, and specifically pull into ports that have the supplies, capacity, and personnel to do all that kind of work they need to be done. Spoiler alert, there ain't a lot of those, and that is not good when keeping a section of water protected requires you to physically be there in the first place. So how did this thing go so wrong? How did the Navy fuck up this badly? Well, the acquisition's shitstorm backstory of this thing could fill a library, but it boils down to it being a product of its time. In the early 2000s, after 9/11, the military was getting flooded with money and throwing greenbacks at any defense contractor giving them a second glance. You know, some of those greenbacks actually eventually worked their way to the stage floor at your mom's workplace. Back then, we were in the GWAT heyday, and GWAT needed things that were flexible, and a modular ship that could go to random points on the map and shoot at pirates or other disenfranchised foreigners was seen as useful. And at the time, it probably would have been. But like many of the other programs of the era, the DoD leaned too much into the technological concepts into this thing that weren't mature enough to actually work. Yeah, I had a PE teacher that also leaned into things not mature enough, but that's not important right now. The designers who built it were expecting Somalians sharing a rusted-out AK, not drone swarms and anti-ship missiles. And it was such a horrible design that the programs to upgrade it largely got canceled, and now we have a bunch of pretty useless ships that make for good YouTube video hit pieces when you need something easy to write about. So is it actually good at anything? Well, actually, sort of, yeah. It can physically go from A to B. The US uses its Navy to project power. When things aren't going how we want them to in random corners of the world, we send the Navy. Navies are very, very expensive, and the Independence class is relatively cheap, at least compared to things like destroyers. Each one of these costs about $500 million, and that's a steal considering a destroyer costs 5 times that much. It's still good for certain low-intensity missions, and by low intensity, I mean no intensity, like doing freedom of navigation missions, aka literally just sailing around near China. Otherwise, it's really only good at being a mobile platform for other things, like helicopters doing counter-narcotics, or just sitting somewhere off the coast to deter bad people from doing bad stuff in countries that can't do that themselves. Those missions are useful, and do help the US in a very broad, big picture sense. But they ain't gonna be helping us reopen the Hormuz anytime soon, especially since they're all in Malaysia. But on that note, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed today's video. Please subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.